snow had a way of erasing the edges of Red Hollow, smoothing the town until it looked less like a place where people lived and more like a thought the world was trying to forget, and in that endless white silence, the loneliness of one small cabin at the edge of town seemed to breathe on its own, waiting for something to change. Ayoka was 20 years old, and she lived alone in that cabin, her days measured not by clocks but by survival, by how much wood she could split before her fingers went numb, by how many steps she took through knee-deep drifts to draw water, by how long she could stand the ache in her shoulders before night claimed the land again, and every motion she made carried the quiet defiance of someone who had learned to endure without asking. The townspeople watched her the way people watch storms, at a distance, with fear disguised as judgment, and their whispers curled through the cold air whenever she passed, never loud enough to confront, never kind enough to help, leaving her wrapped in isolation that felt heavier than the snow on her roof, and still she endured, wondering how long a person could stand alone before the silence answered back. Elias Mercer noticed her long before he ever spoke to her, a 30-year-old cowboy with weather-worn hands and eyes that held more quiet thought than most men in Red Hollow ever allowed themselves, and from the first winter morning he saw her chopping frozen logs while the wind cut at her like a blade. Something in his chest tightened, not with pity, never that, but with a recognition so deep it startled him, as if some forgotten part of his soul had stirred awake and was asking him to pay attention. He never approached her at first, never risked becoming another man she would have to turn away, choosing instead the quieter language of care, repairing the sagging fence beside her cabin beneath a moonlit sky, leaving neatly stacked firewood where her eyes would find it at dawn, stepping back into the dark before his presence could demand explanation, and with every small act, he wondered if she noticed, or if she noticed and chose not to, and that wondering followed him home like a held breath that refused to release. When she finally confronted him, the cold carved the space between them into something fragile, her breath rising like misted glass, her eyes sharp with the learned truth that kindness often hid its teeth, and when she said, "I don't need kindness," her voice carried the weight of every time survival had cost her softness, as if daring him to fail her the way the world always had. Elias didn't soften his tone or defend himself, didn't reach for excuses or apologies, only met her gaze with a steadiness that did not flinch and said, "Didn't say you did," and in that simple refusal to claim her gratitude, something unsettled flickered between them, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ayoka felt certainty loosen its grip, and the ground beneath her beliefs quietly shift. Days passed beneath a sky that seemed determined to bury the town, snow thickening until silence became a presence of its own, and Elias found reasons to pass by her cabin, warnings of storms carried on the wind, supplies left without ceremony, a quiet watchfulness that neither pressed nor retreated, and though Ayoka accepted what was given, she refused to accept the meaning behind it, telling herself that people always wanted something, that every kindness was a debt waiting to be collected, and that trusting otherwise was dangerous. People help only when they want something, she told him one afternoon as the light faded too early, her words sharpened by old wounds that still ached beneath the surface, and for a moment she braced herself for disappointment, for the truth she expected him to admit. Elias was quiet before he answered, as if weighing his words against the weight of her past, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried no persuasion, only truth. "Then it's good I want nothing," he said, eyes steady on hers, "except to see you safe," and though she did not believe him, could not yet afford to, the way he said it stayed with her long after he walked away, like a question her heart kept asking in the quiet, even as she tried to ignore it. The storm came fast that winter, rolling in with a violence that felt almost personal, as if the land itself had decided to test every fragile thing that still dared to stand, and it was on the sharp edge of that gathering chaos that Silas Crown arrived, a 55-year-old rancher whose wealth had taught him to confuse possession with right, his coat heavy with fur, his smile weighted with assumption, and when he filled Ayoka's doorway and told her she would be his wife by morning, the air between them stiffened, recoiling as though even the walls refused to bear witness. "I'd rather die in the snow," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken, and in that refusal lived every battle she had already survived alone, and for a brief moment Silas looked almost startled, as though he had forgotten that a woman could still choose herself, before anger hardened his face and the storm outside answered for him, howling against the cabin like a warning meant too late. When night fell, fear did not make her weak. It made her run, boots sinking deep into the drifts as snow lashed her skin raw, breath tearing at her chest while she fled not toward safety but toward freedom, and behind her the lanterns appeared, swaying through the white darkness like cruel stars, Silas and his men convinced that winter would finish what their hands intended to begin. They caught her when her strength finally gave way, rough fingers closing around her arms as the wind screamed its fury, and in that blinding chaos, with snow burning her eyes and the world reduced to cold and pain, she wondered if this was how it ended, not with love or justice, but with silence swallowing her voice whole. Elias felt the storm shift before he saw it, a change in the air that unsettled something deep in his chest and pulled him from his chair as though called by a thread he didn't know existed, and when he reached Ayoka's cabin to find the door yawning open and the hearth long cold, panic struck harder than any wound he had ever known, hollowing him out as he whispered into the night, "Please, don't let the storm take her," as if the snow might still be listening. He followed the tracks until they blurred into nothing, trusting instinct over sight, love over fear, and when he found them, Silas, the men, and Ayoka barely upright beneath the weight of the storm, he did not shout or rage, only raised his gun and let his voice cut clean and steady through the chaos, a calm born not of violence but of devotion. "Let her go. Now." "She belongs to," Silas began, and Elias interrupted him without anger, without doubt. "She belongs to herself," and in that quiet declaration, something ancient and right seemed to settle back into the world, as though it had been waiting to be spoken. When the men retreated, Elias did not hesitate. He gathered Ayoka into his arms, her body light against his chest, her breath uneven and fragile, and as he carried her away through the storm, snow erasing the ground behind them, she drifted between fear and safety, caught between the memory of being hunted and the unfamiliar steadiness of being held, unsure which would claim her, but already feeling, in the way his arms never tightened too hard nor loosened too soon, that something gentle was refusing to let her go. Elias's cabin was warm and hushed, the kind of quiet that did not press down but invited breath back into the body, firelight breathing softly along the wooden walls as if the room itself were alive and listening, and he wrapped Ayoka in blankets with a care so gentle it felt almost reverent, asking nothing of her in return, only safety, moving about the space to warm soup, to tend the fire, to make room for her without ever making her feel claimed, and when he gave her his bed and settled himself on the floor near the hearth, the distance he chose became a kindness deeper than touch, one she had never known how to name. "Why are you doing this?" she asked at last, her voice thin as frost, as though the question itself might break what little peace she had left, and Elias did not answer immediately, staring instead into the fire as if it held truths he needed to gather before offering them. "Because when the storm came," he said finally, his voice low and unguarded, "my heart ran looking for you, and there was no heroism in the confession, no demand hidden inside it, only truth, and something inside Ayoka loosened, a tightness she had carried so long she had forgotten it could ease, allowing sleep to claim her without fear for the first time in years, her breath evening out beneath the weight of his quiet presence. Morning arrived pale and cold, bringing no justice with it, only betrayal dressed in authority, as Sheriff Harold Boone dismissed her story with a look that refused to see her and protected Silas with a silence heavier than snow, and when Elias spoke, the restraint he had worn like armor finally cracked, not into shouting or threats, but into a sharp, controlled fury that made the truth impossible to ignore even as it was denied. That night, as snow fell softly once more, gentler now, Elias stood before Ayoka with the fire low and the world narrowed to the space between them, and when she said again, "I don't need kindness," it no longer sounded like armor but like a final question, a last test shaped by every wound she had survived. "Then let me give you my name," he answered, stepping no closer, giving her the choice entirely, his voice steady with intention. Not my pity, and the tears that filled her eyes were not born of fear or desperation but of relief, because being chosen, openly, freely, was different from being saved, and for the first time, she did not feel like something fragile being carried, but like someone seen. Their marriage came quietly and properly beneath a sky of falling snow that felt less like a burden and more like a blessing finally allowed to land, witnesses standing close in respectful silence as vows were spoken with dignity, honoring not rescue but partnership, and when Elias said, "I choose you," in storm and silence, and Ayoka answered, "I choose you," where I am no longer alone, the world seemed to pause, as if holding that promise carefully in its hands. Marriage did not banish winter, but it softened every edge of it, filling their cabin with shared meals and quiet laughter, with fingers brushing at the table and hands finding each other by the fire, with kisses stolen beneath falling snow and warmth built slowly, day by day, and when Ayoka smiled one evening and said, "I used to fear nights," Elias drew her closer and replied, "Now they belong to us," and in that simple truth, the past loosened its hold a little more, surrendering to a future that felt, at last, gently and undeniably theirs. Justice arrived not with raised fists or shouted threats, but with truth spoken at last, trembling yet unbreakable, as a young ranch hand stepped forward, guilt weighing heavier than fear, his voice cracking beneath the burden of what he had seen and carried alone, and the proof he brought, simple, undeniable, broke the silence that had protected cruelty for too long. So when lawmen from a neighboring county arrived, untouched by local favors or fear, Silas Crown's power unraveled not in spectacle but in quiet inevitability, collapsing the way false things always do when faced with light. "I never belonged to you," Ayoka said as Silas was led away through falling snow, her voice steady and clear, not raised, not shaking, and beside her Elias stood, not as a rescuer, not as a man claiming victory, but as a witness who let her words stand on their own, and in that shared stillness, the balance of their love revealed itself, equal and unafraid. When the sheriff's badge was removed and set aside like a relic of a broken promise, when apologies came haltingly from townspeople who had once watched her struggle in silence, Ayoka accepted their words without bitterness, because dignity, once claimed, did not need to argue for its place, and Elias watched her then with a quiet awe, loving her not for her survival alone, but for the grace she carried in its aftermath. In the end, they stood together outside their cabin as snow fell endlessly, soft and unhurried, the world hushed around them, and Elias drew his coat around Ayoka with a tenderness that felt less like protection and more like belonging, as though the gesture itself carried every vow he had already spoken, and when she looked up at him and said, "You gave me more than safety," her voice warm with truth, he leaned close and replied, "I gave you my name," and in that exchange, the storm that had once defined her life finally lost its power to reach them. And if you listen closely, even now, you might hear the lesson the winter wind still carries, that love rarely arrives with thunder or grand promises, but with steady footsteps in the snow, with hands that choose to stay when leaving would be easier, that dignity can survive even the coldest storms when it is met with devotion rather than demand, and that the truest kindness is not something offered to be earned or repaid, but something lived so gently and faithfully that it softens the world itself, leaving it quieter, warmer, and forever waiting for the next heart brave enough to love without fear.